I think we have to look at the question of where we are against the backdrop of where we have been.
Yeah.
And I'd like to take as the line of division the massive, transformation line that, sort of got into place in the mid-1990s, coinciding more or less with the famous transition in South Africa, and the renewal of hope in what was called the African Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, against that backdrop, we've had different trajectories, of growth, of development, of democratization, governance reforms, and all of those things. And yet, we have seen, over the last couple of years, that the more things have changed, the more they have tended to remain the same. Now, there are a few countries, that have had the leap, not fulfilled promises, but the leap, that shows that there is hope, in the immediate and distant future. But for the most part, it's the same old story.
What happened to these initiatives? You talk, for instance, about African Renaissance, and those were coupled by the new Partnership for Africa's Development. Other very important initiatives under that, including peer review mechanisms and so on, governance mechanisms that were there. What happened?
A lot also happened, but I think, we need to remember the context within which these things were happening. It's a shame, that one has to admit this. These things were happening at a time when Africa was, as a whole, unable to articulate a coherent framework, of a development initiative. And so a lot of, what went into these partnerships and so on, were matters of so-called consensus, even though this talk of consensus would suggest some kind of negotiation. There were matters of conditionality and dictation and imposition in the name of consensus. Because, let's face it, what are these initiatives about? What targets did they have? These were targets that were determined in the manner of received paradigm, from powerful global actors. So it was simply a question of, the African states getting together, to find a place under the sun, for something that really was so constrained, it would be difficult to say the Africans had a voice or that they had a choice, in some of those initiatives. So the long and short of it all is one has to understand the very tortuous, milieu, of the global climate to appreciate what is going on.
So in other words, are you suggesting that these initiatives were largely imposed on Africans?
To a large extent. It was the message of the times. This was the ferment of neoliberalism. And, it was a world that, in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, had become almost unipolar. Very hegemonic, very powerful, global north, extending its tentacles all over the world and getting into line countries that had divergent, or separate trajectories of growth. The whole business of regime change, to make the world safe, for liberalism. So in a sense, I think that the African leaders themselves, found that they had to line up, behind this agenda, that they were not part of fashioning in any way. And because your performance was going to depend on the extent to which you were able to embrace, the new thinking, and the extent also that funding, was a critical issue, and many of these African countries depend on foreign aid.
I think the African leaders may very well argue that actually they at a particular time when they were talking African Renaissance, they were dictating the agenda, or at least part of the agenda, as opposed to receiving kind of compared to now. If you go to former President Olusegun Obasanjo, you go to former President Thabo Mbeki, and they will say, well, at least what we're trying to do was to lead the discourse, to be part of the agenda, the discourse itself.
Well, you're right. I mean, to the extent that a few of them, you should have added Abdoulaye Wade of Senegal, to the extent that these people were involved at all in some kind of talk, with Western donors and those very important international development partners, one could say so. But the point is, these were received paradigms, if you like. They were set paradigms. They were part and parcel of an evolving, ideological movement, that fully unraveled after the Cold War ended. And it was simply a question of, look, this is what we're doing. And you say, yes, the African formation requires that you think of things differently. To that extent, why not? You can talk about the African voice. But it's the whole point about understanding that this is all a struggle for power. And for space.
But the issue is also to find space for yourself within that evolution. Yes, it was an evolving environment, but you identify a particular space. But does Africa still have a space in that evolution? Because even today, global politics evolves.
No, well, I mean, every person must have a space. It's the nature of the space that is more important. Some spaces are more autonomous, than other spaces. Let me introduce two concepts, that I'm sure would help us in this regard. There are what you call invited spaces. Now, the converse would be organic and self-determined spaces. Now, within the context of the evolving, global order, you had, those who were like the patrons of this order, inviting others, not on their own terms, but to find how they will fit in, in a manner that would make the integration process less tedious, and less burdensome. So to that extent, if you get invited and you have space, you can begin to use that as a platform, for beginning to assert yourself, moving towards self-determined spaces. But the constraints are enormous. And remember that, when you pick South Africa and you pick Senegal and you pick Nigeria and you pick Tunisia, there is the whole of Africa that you have not picked. Okay? And, one of the things that, we have as a problem is the inability of Africa to forge a common voice. So in other words, African governments that are reforming governments find, themselves having to account more, to external actors, that fund these things than to the people themselves. And so you find the paradox that many countries have experienced. On the one hand, you have international development partners praising, how well people have performed. The reforms are now, underway and they are good. And yet the people within are hard put to see, what these reforms are doing. Because at the end of it all,
examples of such countries?
Oh, well, from the past, you had the situation in Uganda, that was a beautiful bride, of the Bretton Woods institutions, supposedly doing very well, in terms of reforms. And yet Ugandans, didn't see what was going on. Or even Ghana. In the late 80s and early 90s, Ghana was, a champion of reforms. And yet, poverty remained, very, very widespread. People were disempowered, and so on. So what I'm saying, basically, is there are issues, of the connection between those who govern and the citizens. And again, this is a fundamental problem because many of these countries themselves have issues to resolve.
Let me just quickly take this one call. Please put on your headphones for me, if you may. Let's go to Durban. There's Ashanti.
Thank you for the clarity, Professor. And one of the things, as I listen to you about the uneven development of the whole of Africa, that does not speak to what the rest of the world is claiming that we're about. Is this protest that's called the APRM that should have been able to help us to have that collective discussion? I don't know if you can speak to it. I don't know if you think it's still relevant. I don't know where it sits, because African Renaissance, for some reason, has lost its steam. NEPAD somehow has not been clear in the last couple of years as to what exactly they're doing. Please, Professor, speak to the APRM. Is it relevant? Was it helpful? What exactly are we going to do with the information from that?
Professor?
Well, let me quickly return to Ashanti, who called in to ask about the APRM. Now, I think any package of peer review is an important element. It shows self-consciousness. It shows the presence of mind. It shows the readiness to take on what other lessons can be drawn. And so you can see that external people who are your peers, can tell you exactly who you are. So to that extent, APRM it's a beautiful idea. But then the question is, who's APRM? Which people are involved? Again, it's all to do with what I had defined earlier as invited spaces. Now, you call people, it's a procedure thing. How do you see this? What do you think we can do? How do you think we can do all of these things? And you stop there. APRM will be more meaningful in the lives of these people if you then follow up to say, look, this is what we have done, and these are the fallouts. These are the things we think we should now do. Well, there are leaders and there are leaders. We talked about Wanlimu Julius Nyerere.
Yeah.
That's one leader. We've also talked about Kwame Nkrumah. That's one leader. Even today, there may be unsung leaders, who are not in the front line, but they are doing well. Unfortunately, I don't have ready examples to give. But there must be leaders.
But that's the problem, that there are no ready examples to give.
None comes immediately to mind.
Sure.
But there must be people doing well, at least, who have been elected, that the people like, and so on. They may not be very popular leaders. They may not be the kinds of straight mobilization leaders, people who are in the trenches and so on. But they're just effective leaders. It's possible. I know that that's possible.
And Africa is not ready to deal with these leaders, is unable to eject them where necessary. In other words, I'm saying we are not at a stage where when we see leaders who are here for self-interest as opposed to a national and continental interest, we'll then throw them out.
Unfortunately, there is something that is emerging, which I consider to be very dangerous at the level of regional integration. We have heard in recent times talk of local solutions to local problems.
Yeah.
So we're not going to wait for people from outside Africa to help solve our problems. So there is a problem in Senegal. There's a problem in Ivory Coast. There's a problem in Kenya. There's a problem in Zimbabwe. Almost all of them post-election, problems. What happens? African leaders, another kind of peer review now, intervene in the name of seeking, local solutions, creative solutions to creative problems. And all they're doing is to act to protect the status quo. This doesn't even go beyond Africa. You're talking of peer review in another sense. Now, all that the people do is to come together and say, look, let's maintain the status quo. Even at a time when, it was so obvious that Gaddafi had failed all the tests, of eligibility and legitimacy. We still had, African leaders who wanted status quo in Libya. Now, when Kenya, the Kenyans voted, and they were forthright, and so on, and you had conflict, violence, you had, Kenya, on the precipice. There were all kinds of interventions, and so what is beginning to evolve, it's a very dangerous tendency on the part of, African local solutions to only mean let's bargain while essentially retaining the status quo. People must work out their solutions. They must bargain and negotiate them. The spaces must be created where autonomous action and mobilization is possible. And therefore, you can have proper engagements with people. I like to see, that the nuances, the contours, the ebbs and flows are given free rein, and people have the opportunity to finally decide for themselves how these things should be resolved.
Because ultimately, though, I wanted us to talk about this, that, it may sound all bad, but actually there are developments in the continent has not stayed in the same place.
Of course, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the positives, from even, the whole ferment of democratization and reforms. The fact that people now have freer space, voice has become even more important. People are able to articulate issues of human rights, rule of law, issues of participation, issues of empowerment, and so on. These have become more openly spoken about, and people are able to engage them and articulate them. Somebody mentioned the African diaspora.
Yeah,
I think that's a very important factor in this whole situation. Now, in several countries where it was impossible to engage from within, diaspora communities have been very useful. You would not begin to understand and appreciate, how much the diaspora community of South Sudan, of Ethiopia, of Senegal, of Nigeria, Zimbabwe, of Ghana, how much they contributed to the transformations in these countries. Financially, even the diaspora communities in many countries, have been, very, very critical to the economic prosperity of citizens at home.